Hello students, welcome back to this 10th lecture for the course on psychology of language. Last lecture we were focusing on words, and as I described in the last lecture, we made a shift in learning in the last lecture from the last lecture itself. So, coming lectures are more into uh, the complex dynamics of psychology of language. Up till the 9th lecture, we are looking at the primary factors or primary dynamics of psychology of language. We in detail dealt about some aspects of words in the last lecture, and what we will do today is we will continue those facts. Now, words are important. Why? Because words are the subway station or the mid station between written and the subway station for rather the spoken and written language, and below it you have those constraint parts which make up word, and above it you have things like sentences and discourse. So, this is kind of a midway station where which can be exactly said to be a stop or an important aspect of language, because word symbolizes something called concepts. Now, it is at the level of the word itself where the language takes its true form. Before that it has there are constraint parts which make the language, but word is the most important part of it. Now, before we go into details lecture, let us take a little trip to the first 9 lectures of what we did, so that we have the context set in of how we have been moving along for the past 9 lectures and how we have arrived at this 10th lecture. So, the first lectures, the first couple of lectures were on looking at the need for language, what is language itself, and the need for language. So, where there we discussed what different kinds of languages are there. We looked at the primary language system, which is the animal communication system. We looked at why do animals communicate, the reason for it, and we looked at what are the characteristics of a language like that. Now, as I discussed there is a difference between communication and language, because language has certain facts. Language is more developed, it can express more number of ideas with limited number of symbols, but communications cannot do that. Communication can only express or transfer exchange minimum number of ideas. So, that is one of the things. So, we looked at the primary characteristics of animal communication system, and from there on we looked at the human language system. So, we looked into detail the human language system. We looked at how the structure of the human language system is, right from the idea of phonemes, which is the basic speech sound, to how they compose to get the morphemes, and further on the word, the sentence, the discourse, and so on and so forth. So, we focused on to that, and towards the end of this lecture we were looking at the evolution of language, how language evolved. So, where does it come from, and there we looked at how our great grandfathers, the Neanderthals and the Homo sapiens, how they developed the language system, how do they develop what language is all about, and we looked at several evidences which provide us the fact of how language developed, or how language came from the proto language, the initial language that our great grandfathers had. And one of the evidences that we discussed is something called Pidgin. So, we looked at how the language evolved over the years. So, that was the first section where we were just dwelling around or moving around what language is all about, and then we moved on in the next 2 lectures into doing research in language. So, how do we do research in language? So, we took some model systems or model questions, and based on these questions we evaluated the research process in language. We looked at how research design is made, how a problem is formulated, what is a problem, what is a theory, how does the research cycle move in, how induction and deduction processes in the research cycle lead to the theory giving rise to the hypothesis, then the observations, and how the observation confirms certain results, and then and falsifying certain other results, and then going back to the theory. So, using both the inductive and deductive logic, how do we go about this research plan? that. We also looked at what are experimental designs, what are variables, and how do they play a role in doing research into language. That is what we were doing, and we should took up some model systems, and based on this model systems we did all of what I was talking about. Toward the end of the lecture, we looked at certain brain areas, particularly the Broca area and the Wernicke area, and we looked at how these two areas are important for language and what role do they play in language. Other than that, we also looked at some neuroimaging techniques or details about neuroimaging techniques and how these neuroimaging techniques actually reflect or help us in studying language. So, that is what we did in the first two lectures. So, they were very primary lectures on the research on language. Now, for any language to proceed or for any language to evolve, we have to have the way of listening it. So, we have to have a receiver and we also have to have a producer. So, a mechanism of how language is processed, perceived, and a mechanism of how it is produced in the first place. So, we looked at these two things. So, we started off the section number 3 by looking at how language is perceived, how do we hear. And so, we discussed the idea of how a sound wave is and what are fundamental frequencies, what are overtones and things like that. And other than that, we went into details about the auditory system. So, what is the auditory system like and how the cochlea and basilar membrane, how they are arranged and how they are connected to the primary somatosensory, the primary auditory cortex and the secondary auditory cortex, and how do they actually help us in hearing. Further to that, we also looked at the speech stream. So, when we speak, what actually happens, and that we can understand with the help of something called a spectrograph. So, we looked at what the spectrograph depicts when it perceives speech, and so we looked at what are phonations and things like how consonants and what are consonants and vowels and how are they represented into the speech stream. We also looked at what is prosody and how these variations in vowels and consonants and things like formants, what are sorents, what are fricatives, what are plosives, how. So, these are variations of speech sound. So, certain variations in when a vowel or a consonant is produced and what are they, this is what we looked in detail. We also looked at that the question there was, do we perceive, because since we produce sound in more or less a continuous way. So, whether sound perception is continuous. So, basically how is sound, and so what we found out is that the production of sound is continuous in nature. So, if it is continuous in nature, how do we perceive it, how do we listen to it. And so, we looked at the idea of categorical processing and how boundaries of words and phonemes are actually developed. And so, there we discussed about the phoneme restoration effect, how the certain phonemes, if they are missing in sentences, how they are restored by the brain. Towards the end of it, we looked at the development of speech perception. So, how small children develop these ideas or develop these whole way of perceiving language or listening to language. So, in detail we looked at the all those mechanisms which the child uses to mark word boundaries, to mark phonological boundaries, to know, since speech is continuous, so how does he know where to which word is and that kind of a thing. And towards the end of this section, we are looking at theories of speech perception. So, we looked at 3 basic theories. We looked at the idea of Lieberman's theory, motor theory. So, that basically says that speech perception is basically related to the motor movements of the area which is producing speech. We also looked at and what motor theory says is that by looking at the motor area or those motor movements, the gestures which is producing speech, we can actually generate the idea of what is being said. We also looked at the general auditory framework which says the speech is not special, and so it is like any other perception of sound signal by the brain. And then we looked at the idea of direct realism, which says that the sound, the speech sound which comes to us has all the information in it necessary, and so we do not need to perceive speech as such. The lastly we took overview of how speech is produced. So, we focused on the vocal tract and how the vocal tract produces the various consonants and vowels in English language. So, a detail into that. And then we looked at a little bit into what is the Broca area and what is the Wernicke area and how they are connected, and the vertical and the dorsal streams which connect these areas and how they function in detail. We also looked at the models of speech perception, so various models that we discussed there. And lastly, there we looked at development of speech production. So, how the speech production is developed in children. So, that is what we were doing up till now. And in the immediate lecture before this one, which is lecture number 9, we were looking at words. Now, as I said, word is important because it is a subway station, or it is the main connection between the sentence and the morpheme. So, from word from speech production to speech understanding, the word is the critical point which is there. So, we started looking at what are words in terms of like what does word symbolize. So, what is the meaning of word as such, or what is symbolism of word. And so, there we looked at as word is basically a is a meaningful speech sound or meaningful unit of speech which can stand alone. So, we looked at how words represents certain kind of a concepts and how they are represented. So, word is represented, words not only represent a certain concept or a mental representation of it, words are saved in both phonological and semantic form. So, words basically how words are stored, that is another thing that we looked at. Then we looked at certain kinds of words which exist in the English language, and we looked at the content word, which is the noun, verb and adjective, and these are called the open class verb, and we also looked at the function words. So, content words are the basic word forms which are there, and the function words are additional word forms which help us in connecting certain group of words together. And so, function words are prepositions, determiners and conjunctions. That is what we looked at. We also looked at that words have something called the basic form and something called the extended form. And so, basic forms of word are called the lemma, and the lexeme are all other forms of the word. So, these are called shape shifters. We also looked at the phonology of word form. So, basically how word is composed in terms of its syllables, and we looked at how each word has something called an onset and a rima. And so, onset is the initial consonant proportional of any word, and then the rima is the vowel. The rima basically consists of the nucleus and the coda, and the onset is the consonant, the rima is the nucleus which starts with a vowel and followed by a consonant proportion. So, that is how we looked at how syllables are defined. We looked at phonotactic rules, which are rules for combining phonemes together, and lastly that we did in last class we were looking at symbol grounding problem of how words express symbols, or how do words get the symbols, or how they are related to the symbols. And we looked at 3 theories. The cognitive theory says that by just being together, certain words bringing together, or certain words co-occurring together, they get this symbolism, which was not right, because we challenged this, because Sarel challenged this in through the Chinese room problem, where he found out that just by number of alphabets being together, number of words being together, they do not generate meaning. The second answer that was given to the symbol grounding problem is how do words get the symbol, or gets related to the symbols that it is expressing, or the semantic meaning that the words have, how do they get linked to it. The idea was that it happens in terms of semantic primes, which basically proposes that there are certain basic primes, or there are certain basic concepts which are already available, and based on these concepts other concepts are developed, and the word gets word gets linked to the symbols. Also, there is something called embodied representation, which explains that symbols are understood in terms of perceptual and motor experiences. So, basically it is not the perceptual experience, the motor experience is also there in understanding symbol, and that is where we left off. Now, today what we are going to do is we are going to start off where we left we are discussing the symbol grounding problem. And so, another interesting thing with word is something called sound symbolism. Now, as you look at a word, any word which is there, the what the word says and what the word means are two different things. So, basically there is something called arbitrariness of a the word sound and the meaning that it is relating to. So, sound of a word, the way it is spoken actually gives no information whatsoever about the meaning that is there, and that is what is called the arbitrariness of the sign, which is given by Hockett in 1916. What he says is that observation that sounds of words give virtually no information about what it is meaning. Considering universal properties of language, what would happen is there has to be if language is universal, then it should the word sound should relate to some of its meaning. Now, nevertheless, word forms in languages are more systematic than would be expected if they were truly arbitrary. So, even if it is believed that the way the words are pronounced, it gives no relation to what it is meaning. Still, it is believed by looking at languages around the world, it is believed that they are some form of systematically arranged. Words are systematically arranged, or there is some systematic arrangement of words, some systematic arrangement of word and symbol relation is there across languages. So, it is believed that still systematic sound symbols patterns are frequently used. For example, if you look at the English onset GL, generally it should it relates to most words with light, and that is why you have words like glow, gleam, glitter, glisten and glossy glare. Okay. So, basically what it says is that the way a word is spoken, it although it has no relation, it is totally arbitrary, it is no relation to the meaning. Still, looking at languages around the world, we do see some kind of systematic arrangement in relation to how a word is spoken and what is the meaning of it. And the example that we have given here is, if a word starts with GL, there are very high chances that the number of words which is formed with GL, there are chances that they will mean something related to light. And as you see, the word which are formed with GL, so it does not mean that all words which starts with GL will mean light, but it says that a number of words which start with GL will actually mean light. Now, the arrangement GL and the relation that it has to light, that is what we are talking about, right. So, how it is spoken and how it is related to the concept of life is that we are looking at. So, technically speaking, the GL is arbitrary symbol and it has nothing to do with light. As you go around different languages in the world, most words which represent light will not start with GL. If you look at how light is expressed in German, or how it is expressed in Hindi or any other language, it might be possible that GL will not be the starting word which expresses light. But then even if you look at words all around the world, and even in the English language, what it says is that if GL expresses light, then most words, or some words at least, with GL will tend to be light. As you see, glow, gleam, glitter, glisten, glossy, glare, all are related to light. Now, so basically then there is some kind of systematic arrangement of how the words are pronounced and what it should mean. And then we have the case of onomatopoeia, which is basically these are words which expresses certain sound. So, for example, bang. Now, this is a word which expresses a sound. So, word that represents a sound, for example, thud, bang, animal, noises, oing, ping, these are, or a cat says meow, all these words are basically the onomatopoeia. So, what are these now? So, sound words, they vary widely from languages to language. For example, the pig says oing in English, but boo boo in Japanese. And so, this is another interesting thing to be looked at. More than 90%, 95% of adults agree which is boo boo and which is kiki. If you do a search, you will come to know. So, basically, boo, the way it is spoken, the kiki, the way it is spoken, and the way these are demonstrated, people 95% of adults will agree which of these is bobo and which of these is kiki, and these are sounds for the pig. what the pig speaks in Japanese. Now, how words are learned basically. So, what we have done till now is we looked at what are words and how they attain the concept which is there, and how do they solve the symbol, how words attain not only the concepts, how they are grounded into this concept. So, we looked at how they attain these concepts. So, and what are different kind of words in English language, that is what we have been focusing on. Now, let us look at how words are learned. Now, generally speaking, it is believed that the learning of a vocabulary or words, they start with a S-shaped curve. Now, it is believed that vocabulary acquisition follows a S-shaped curve. Now, from 0 to 18 months, when a child is born, the word learning is very slow. But from 18 to 6 years, there is a vocabulary spurt. So, there is an increase, there is a dramatic increase in vocabulary, and during this day or during this period, 6 words are generally learned by the child each day, with almost 14,000 words at the end of 6 years. So, from age 0 to 18 years, the children learn words very slowly, but from 0 to 18 months, and from 18 months onward to 6 years, there is a vocabulary spurt, and from 6 years ahead, this is a fall. So, word learning drops. And as you see, this is how the curve will look like, the S-shaped curve. So, initially there is a if this is how the child is born, this is 18 months, and from 18 months to 6 years. So, this is 6 years, and from there on there is a drop. This is until 18 months the word learning is slow, vocabulary spurt during the preschool year. So, this is what it is, and word learning tapers off somewhere in the later childhood. So, why does this happen? First of all, reason for this vocabulary spurt, one thing is that naming insight. The children acquire a naming insight. So, they start naming things, and they get this insight that this has a, anything that they see has a particular name, and that is the reason why that particular spurt is there. So, why this spurt is there, or why this increase, sudden increase is there? Because at this age children starts naming things first of all, then they attain the mastery of phonology. From 0 to 18 months, children are still learning or still understanding what are the word boundaries. If something is spoken to them, where should they break the words, and or where should they break the speech stream into its constituent words. So, they are still learning the syntax and still learning how to understand the speech stream, but after within 18 to months to 6 years age, the children has mastered phonology, they have understood the idea of word boundaries and phrase boundaries, and they start learning with this increased phonology or master phonology. They start understanding different words, or start understanding the pronunciation of different words. Also, their memory increases at this period of time. So, the child becomes or the memory power of the child increases, the brain develops, and due to this development the child can now store more number of words and can process more number of words, and then increase social engagement. Also, during this time the child becomes engaged socially, he starts meeting new people, he starts meeting friends and family, and they come up with new words, and the child like a foam, he starts soaking up new words or understanding new words. So, basically then how this learning of word is basically tested. So, before that learning of a word involves constructing a concept. So, how basically what are the steps of learning a word? A word learning or learning about a word starts by first constructing a concept. The child has to first create a concept of a word. For example, if the word is cup, the child has to create the concept of this word, and the concept creation requires us to understand its characteristics. So, what is word? It is something for cup is something for storing a liquid. It has a handle, it is used for drinking, and so on and so forth. So, these are the characteristics of this cup, and the child then has to make this idea or this kind of a concept that cup is this, if an object has these properties, then it is a cup. So, first thing is learning this construct or this concept of what a cup is, and then they learn to learning the phonological word form, and then they learn the phonological word form. For example, how the cup is pronounced, that is another thing, and then there is something called associating concept with word form. So, it is a 3-step process. In the first step, the child creates a concept based, and this concept has these characteristics. Then it learns how cup is pronounced, the phonology of it, and then the third is they associate this phonology with this concept. So, this cup is associated. This is the steps in which the learning of a word takes place. So, basically word learning starts with constructing a concept, then a phonological word form, and then links between concept, meaning and phonological form. So, how do we test this? How do we test that what words are learned? There are two ways to doing it. One is called the receptive vocabulary and the other is called the productive vocabulary. So, what is receptive vocabulary? So, looking at children who are learning words, and as I said, word learning starts with first forming a concept. The child has to know that whatever name has been given to it, or whatever name he is repeating, whatever word he is repeating, that has certain properties, and this is a concept. For example, cup is a concept, and so he has to learn that, and this concept will have certain properties, and so this is how it does. Not only that, he also has to learn the phonological properties of how cup is pronounced, and then later relate to that. But how do I test that this word is learned, or how much word is learned by a child? That is done by something called receptive vocabulary, and the receptive vocabulary of children. And what is receptive vocabulary? It is a set of word persons recognize and understands the meaning of. So, receptive vocabulary is the number of words, it is a set of words or number of words person recognizes and understands the meaning of, and it is also, word learning is also tested in terms of productive vocabulary, which is a set of words person produces in appropriate context. So, receptive vocabulary is how many words can you understand the meaning of, right. So, and you can recognize that, and productive vocabulary. So, it may so happen that you may not understand the meaning of a word, but you can actually use a word in a particular sentence or a particular context, and that is called productive vocabulary. So, set of words person produces in appropriate context, that is there. So, you may know a word, but you may not be able to use it, or it may be possible that you using a word in a particular context, but you may not be able to understand the meaning of. That could also happen. This happens with us in reading also. Sometimes we read, and based on the context we develop the meaning of, or we extract the meaning of certain words. So, this is basically the receptive and productive vocabulary. So, then how does this process of learning the word actually takes place? The concept formation that we talk about. So, this concept formation, the understanding the phonological form and relating the concept formation with the phonological form, how does this take place, or what is the process? So, there are two ways to looking at it. The one is called the fast mapping and the other is called the slow mapping. So, in fast mapping, what happens? It is the ability to learn new words only after a few exposures. So, children learn words basically linking the concept and phonology together by using either the fast mapping or the slow mapping system. In the fast mapping, what happens? It is the ability to learn new words only after a few exposures which are there. So, word recognition, as I said, word recognition starts with speech perception and assessing of the phonological representation before the semantic representation. So, first understanding the phonological representation and then understanding the semantic representation. So, how is word recognized? Now, word production begins with the semantic representation and accessing a phonological representation for the speech production. Word repetition accesses a phonological representation, but not necessarily the semantic representation, since we can repeat words we do not have meaning for. And so, that is how it is. This is word repetition, this is word production, and this is word recognition. If you look at word recognition, it starts with something called speech perception. Then speech perception leads to phonological representation, and a receptive link is established between semantic representation. If you look at word production, how word is produced, it starts with semantic representation. First, you have to think about the concept. So, if you want to produce a word, you have to think about that word or what it represents, and then through an expressive link generate the possible phones which should express this word, and from there you will produce speech. But in word representation, a speech perception and speech production are the only reasons which are there, and it happens only at the level of the phonological representation. It does not go to the level of semantic representations. Now, in learning word, another a major problem that happens in learning word is something called referential uncertainty. And so, what is differential uncertainty? The differential uncertainty problem says that there is no direct link between the word and the object that it refers to. So, basically differential uncertainty is an observation that there is no direct link between the word and the object event it refers to. Now, how to solve this differential uncertainty? See, words refer to certain concepts, and what happens is if you look at the word in different languages, it may so happen that it may not represent the same concept. For example, look at dog. Now, the concept is it is a pet animal, it barks, 4 legs, has a tail, but Inu is also representing the same concept, and Gau is also representing the same concept, and Hund, the word, is representing the same concept. Now, this is basically called differential uncertainty. There is no direct link between the word and the object it is representing to. All these words are representing to the same thing. So, there is no direct link between them. So, how do I or multiple words representing the same concept. So, how do I solve this referential uncertainty in word perception or word recognition? The first idea is something using called whole object representation. So, what is the whole object representation? So, basically solving referential uncertainty is through providing certain kind of cognitive constraints to children. So, cognitive constraints that guide children in narrowing down the possible range of reference for a new word. Now, let us look at this. Let us assume that a child learns a new word. For example, he learns the word dog. Now, there is no link because the parent says dog, and the parent shows the child a dog and he says dog, but it may be possible that there are certain other things, maybe a cat is sitting right next to the dog. So, how does the child know what is the dog? And even if he looks at the dog, maybe he sees the dog has a head and he has a tail which is whirling around, it has 4 legs. So, whether this tail is the dog or whether this body is the dog or the whole object is the dog, or what is the dog, how does it know that dog means everything? So, how do you solve this kind of a referential uncertainty? And that happens by providing certain kind of cognitive constraints. So, that and why these cognitive constraints are provided, or how these cognitive constraints actually help the child in solving the referential uncertainty what the parent is referring to, that is done by using cognitive constraints which narrow down the possible range of reference for a new word. So, if the child is learning a new word, these cognitive constraints help him in understanding that okay, this is the idea or this is the object that the parent is referring to or anybody is referring to. So, certain kind of cognitive constraints are used. One is called the whole object assumption. Now, the new word refers to entire object and not just part of it. One assumption that small children use while learning a new word is that whenever a parent is showing a particular or telling him or making him learn a new word, he is actually referring to the whole thing, the whole object that the parent is pointing at. For example, if the parent is making the child learn dog, he assumes that the whole dog is what is being referred to. Dog does not refer to just the tail or the legs and so on and so forth, and so the child follows this whole object assumption. So, assume doggy means the whole animal and not just the tail of it. So, this is one way of solving the referential uncertainty problem. What are the other ways of solving this referential uncertainty problem? The other way is using taxonomic assumptions. So, what is taxonomic assumptions? New word extends to other similar referents. So, basically what it means that assuming doggy means similar animals in general, not just this specific animal, which basically means that child now understands that doggy or dog, what the parent is referring to is first of all it is the object, the whole object, the whole 4-legged animal which is there, and also other animals which are similar to this particular dog will also be called doggy. So, that is called taxonomic assumption. He extends this idea to other members of the group. And then something called mutual exclusivity assumption is also used by the child, and so it means that no two words mean exactly the same thing. It would mean that two words do not exactly mean the same thing. So, if the parent says dog and he says tail, it does not mean that, it should not mean that, or he believes that dog and tail are two different things. It is not the same thing. If he does not use these assumptions, he will never learn the idea of how words are related, or how words are related to certain concepts. And so, no two words are, so mutual exclusively assumption says that no two words mean exactly the same thing, assuming that tail does not mean doggy, but rather something about the dog. So, this is another thing that the child uses in solving the referential uncertainty problem. So, this is about fast mapping. As I said, if word learning is fast, or word learning can be done in a fast way while learning words in one or two demonstration only. There is another way to learning word, and that is called the slow mapping. In this, what happens is learning words gradually over multiple exposures. So, basically then resolving this referential ambiguity that we are talking about, or this referential uncertainty, is basically same as, it's not the same as establishing a permanent link in memory between word form and concept. Basically, if word learning produces word in appropriate context, this is fast learning, and it leads to something called associative learning. Now, there is another way of learning words, and that is called the slow mapping of words, and so learning words over mutual exposures. And for that, we have something called the cross situational word learning. In this way also children learn word. And how do they learn word through the slow mapping? By using something called cross situational word learning. What happens here is associative novel words with novel objects by tracking co-occurrence statistics. So, what happens here is that cross situational word learning is the ability to learn associative novel words with novel objects, even in case of referential ambiguity, by tracking co-occurring statistics. Now, it so may happen that the child develops this referential uncertainty, but what he does is, if the same dog appears in many number of contexts. So, it appears with a cat, and then in some other instance or some other time the dog appears with a table, and in third instance the dog appears with food, and so on and so forth. So, the child develops this referential statistics, or this referential develops this co-occurrence statistics, and based on that he develops this idea that, okay, since this object is coming every time and the second object that it is coming with is varying. So, this is particularly what the parent is referring to, or this is particularly what the concept is, and this is what a dog is all about. So, basically how he does that? He does that using something called a propose but verify strategy. When encountering a new word in an ambiguous context, both childs and adults they make a guess about what the word actually refers to. The repeated co-occurrence of a word and referent in different contexts solidifies the connection between the word form and concept in long term memory. So, as I explained, in multiple occurrences, if he sees the same word co-occurring with other words which are there, he slowly develops this idea that this is what probably the concept is referring to, or this word is referring to this particular concept, or what is the meaning of this word. So, this is what a dog is all about. There is also something called joint attention, that also leads to a process of slow learning. So, what is joint attention? Situations in which all participants focus attention on the same object or event, and it reduces referential ambiguity. So, a situation in which all participants in an interaction have focused their attention on the same object or event, in those cases, so everybody who is talking about that or in that conversation has focused their attention on that particular word, and that leads to a situation of joint attention, and this leads to referential ambiguity. So, everybody points at the same thing and says dog, or referring to the same thing and it says dog, it is basically the idea of joint attention. And then there is something called syntactic bootstrapping is also used. It is the use of syntactic information to infer meaning of verbs. For example, John is groping versus John is groping to the cat, and so this basically in this case the verb is used through, or verb is identified through something called syntactic bootstrapping. So, using the syntactic information, the idea of what a verb really means. So, basically the idea or the meaning of this groping is understood through this. So, basically if somebody says John is groping one picture and the other picture is John is groping the cat. So, groping, what does it really mean? That is expressed, or that is understood by the child by using this syntactic bootstrapping, which basically means that groping is a verb, and so this is the act of groping. So, he looks at multiple sentences with groping, and based on that he develops the meaning of groping from those sentences. For example, by hearing the word ball in several situations where a ball and other objects are present, the infant can gradually infer the meaning of ball. So, this is ball, this is bat in one situation, this is dog, this is ball in another situation. The infant knows that this is what the ball is, and this is called the cross modal statistics. So, then again nouns are more easier to learn their verb because their referents are concrete objects, and the child can look at the and interact with them. So, learning verbs is difficult than nouns is because nouns actually have concrete referentials in comparison to verb. Gleitman 1990 found that young children make use of syntactic information to infer the meaning of verb, and that is how what we showed to you. So, basically they use something called syntactic bootstrapping for understanding the meaning of word. And how does this happen? They look at the different contextual cues in different ways, in different pictures. So, John is groping the cat, something is John is groping the table, or John is groping something else, and so that is how he understands what groping, the act of groping actually means, because in several pictures if the same person does the same act with different objects, he understands that okay, what is happening is this is, or different people also do that act, he understands that this is the meaning of act, and that is called syntactic bootstrapping. Now, infants use their partial knowledge of syntax to make inferences about the meaning of newly encountered words. Given the frame the x is y, the child knows x is probably a noun phrase and y is a verb phrase. Now, if you look at this, this is a verb, is being, be is a verb, and so the child understands that x is y is basically x is the noun phrase and is y is the verb phrase, and based on that he understands the meaning. So, a model of speech perception is there, he uses phonetic and prosodic analysis, and based on that prosodic boundaries he understands that this is the noun phrase and this is the verb phrase, and so he then extracts the functional word and uses the mental lexicon to look at the content words, lexical access is there, and semantic representations, pre-lexical information and speech signal. So, basically uses this kind of a model to extract the meaning of the partial knowledge of syntax helps them in understanding the meaning of newly encountered words. So, basically then another interesting thing in learning words in children is in terms of what neighborhood words are there and how neighborhood words actually influence word learning. Now, characteristics of word form affect how easily they are learned. For example, one interesting thing is word frequency. So, the word form that you are using, they can influence, or they can, this word form will tell, or they can basically predict how easily words are learned. Now, one interesting fact is something called word frequency, how often a particular word occurs in all forms of the language. So, word frequency is how often a word in all forms occurs in a language. If you see more number of the same word in more number of forms it is appearing in a language, it is more easily learned. Also, function words, for example, the and of are remembered more frequently than context word, which are content word, which are learned in less common. Now, children learn rare words more often than they learn and also children learn the nouns first, followed by the verbs. So, most children learn the noun first, then they learn the verb, then they learn the adjective, and do not use function words regularly. So, basically if you look at children, what they do is this function words and verbs are something that they learn late. They learn the noun, because nouns can be used in all different forms in a language. Look at any noun, for example, dog. So, dogs, doggy, and so on and so forth. So, basically in different forms, in a singular, in a plural, first person, second person, and so in different ways the nouns can be used, and so they are learned faster than verbs and adjectives, and function words, the connecting words are learned the least or the last by children. So, another interesting thing is neighborhood density. So, what is neighborhood density? How many other words differ from a particular word by substituting a single phoneme, that is called neighborhood density of a particular word. For example, look at this, if we have hat, now the neighborhood density of this is, if we replace the H phoneme and keep the AT phoneme, these number of words can actually be formed. We can have pat, chat, cat, bat, fat, sat, wat, and if we replace the A phoneme and keep the H and T, we can have heat, hit, hate, hot, hoot, height, and if we remove the T phoneme and let the H and A phoneme be here, we can have words like hatch, hack, had, hag. So, it has high number of high density there. But if you look at words like juice, it is very difficult to find a thing like that. For example, remove the J phoneme, you will have goose, lose, use, moose, noose. But if with replacing the UI phoneme and JCE, we will have no word at all. And in fact, if we replace the CE phoneme, we can have jewel and June. So, it has a very narrow neighborhood density, and this has a high neighborhood density. So, neighborhood density is another interesting thing which is helping the child learn words. Also, we use something called the phonetectic probability, which is the likelihood that a particular sequence of phonemes will occur in a particular language. That is also used by children in learning word. For example, stress patterns can also influence word learning in youngsters. We have, if we have a 2-syllable noun, a triachic form which is a strong weak form, the stress pattern will be easier to be learned by the children. For example, words like basket and pillow. But if you have a iambic an iambic syllable form of 2 nouns, for example, we have weak and strong pattern, for example, guitar and amount, this will take more time for the child to learn. Now, infants then use something called the metrical segment that we have discussed before strategy to infer word boundaries before stress syllable. And Estes in 2013, they found that infants need support both from the stress patterns and the phonetectic regularity to learn words. So, basically it is the phonetectic regularity, phonetectic probability, the stress patterns, they also influence how a word is learned or how a word learning will actually happen. So, word learning, so how are words stored? The way words are stored into the memory, they are stored as in phonological form. So, how are words actually learned? The mental lexicon is the storage of information about a word in long term memory. Now, any word is stored in 2 forms. It is stored in a phonological information, which is the pronunciation of the word, and then it has a semantic information, which is the meaning of the word. So, mental lexicon, storage of information about word in long term memory, and it is done in these 2 ways. So, word are stored as a set of phonemes. We are only looking at the phonological form, we are not looking at the semantic form now. So, words are stored as set of phonemes, evidences, and so this idea that words are stored in the mental lexicon in the long term memory in terms of a set of phonemes is evident from speech errors. For example, if we say keep your feet moving, and we can have errors like foot moving, and this kind of error from feet moving to foot moving actually expresses the EE turns into OO, and this basically says that the words are actually stored in terms of pronunciation also in the mental lexicon. Also, problems like speech errors like this, take my bike becomes bake my bike, is because the T is replaced by a B sound, and that is the reason why the take becomes bake. And this basically, these speech errors give us an idea that words are not only stored as meaning in the mental lexicon in the long term memory, words are also stored in terms of the phonological form or in terms of the pronunciation. Now, very common words are actually stored as syllables. Only basic form of a word is stored in memory, other forms are generated through the rule. For example, we have this. So, basically what happens is that in the long term memory, you only have the basic word form which is stored, which is the lemma, and this lemma, then people use this lemma to produce, to reproduce or to generate more forms of the word. So, can generate plurals and past tenses from non words, and the reason or the clue that basic forms of the word are stored into the mental lexicon is that people can generate plural and past tenses for non words also. Basically, if non words if we can generate plural for non words, it basically means that the generation of plural is a process oriented thing, it is not a storage oriented thing. Had plurals been stored into long term memory, then non words plural would not have been stored, because people do not learn non words. But the moment you understand this, that people are able to generate plurals for non word, it basically means that people are only storing the lemma, the basic form of a word. For example, dax means daxes and blick means blicked, and if you are able to generate this kind of plural, this is a process. Generating plural is a process oriented thing and it is not a storage oriented thing, and this basically says that words are stored into the basic lemma form only. So, blick is there, and that is why we can generate the plural. So, we can generate plural for these kind of thing. Also, irregular words are stored separately. So, irregular word forms are separate entries or by analogy. For example, foot, feet, but facetiously moves is mees. So, that is what it is, and so it means that irregular forms, irregular word forms are actually stored into the memory. So, in its entire form, but in not as lemma, but it is entire form. So, for example, moves, mees will be stored, and for foot, feet will be stored, and that is the regular form. So, words stored separately. For example, men and man both will be stored. So, because the plural of man is man, and so though both have to be stored into the in these cases both have to be stored into the long term memory. But for words like let us say dog or cat, only the dogs we can make plural with dogs and cats, which basically means that only the word dog or cat is stored into the long term memory, which is the lemma form. But this kind of men or goose, geese, data, datum, for these both forms have to be stored in long term memory. Now, the experimental evidence is there. The experimental evidence says that the basic form is there in the mental lexicon, and suffixes, if you put suffixes, word recognition or word production is there. So, inflection suffixes add for purpose of grammar. For example, toy, toys, play, plays, played, playing. So, this kind of a inflection suffix, which is suffix plus word for grammar in the inflectional form. For example, toy leads to toys and play leads to both play, plays, played. That gives us some idea that word is stored in the these kind of basic words is stored in terms of the lemma form. There is something called derivational suffix, which changes meaning and grammatical category. For example, look at agree, in a verb it means agreement, and in noun it means agreeable, and so this is the derivational suffix. So, using the inflectional suffix you can produce various forms of the word, and derivational suffix says that verb can also change its grammatical category, and more frequent words are recalled more quickly, and that happens because of something called the base frequency effect. The frequency effect of base of for extends to inflected forms. The frequency effect of the base forms extends to its inflected forms. Not all derived words form exhibit the base frequency word. For example, look at the et suffix, ity. If you add it to the adjective serene, it becomes serenity, which is a noun. So, also to derive forms, if no change of pronunciation is there, for agree means agreement, and no base frequency effect with change in pronunciation, for example, serene becomes serenity. So, base frequency effect is that. Now, so that is how the phonological representations of words are stored, or how words are stored into the phonological representation. So, we will take a break today, and we will look at the mental lexicon, or exploring the mental lexicon in terms of the semantic forms of word in the next class. So, before we do that, let us look at what we did today. So, what we did in today's lecture is we looked at the idea of how sound symbolism or the arbitrariness of any word, how that arbitrariness is solved, and how the referential ambiguity is solved in terms of words understanding or understanding words. We also looked at how words are learned, what is the process of learning words, and what is receptive and productive vocabulary. We looked at two methods of word learning, which is the fast learning and how fast learning takes care of this referential ambiguity, and we also looked at the slow learning of words which are there. So, we looked at several in fast learning, we looked at the idea of the whole assumption, the taxonomic assumption and mutual exclusivity assumption of solving the referential ambiguity. We also looked at how neighboring words or the density of neighboring words actually help us in learning words. We also looked at the various phonological forms of how words are stored. So, basically those evidences that words are stored in terms of its phonology or in terms of how they are pronounced. Now, when we meet next, we will look at the semantic forms of how words are stored, and we will deal in detail of how the semantic forms are related to the phonological form and how actually words are stored. We also will look at how words are retrieved from long term memory, what is the process of retrieving the word from long term memory when we meet in the next lecture. So, up till that time that we meet in the next lecture, it is goodbye and thank you.